In this module, we're going to be looking at Frankish Gaul. So if you remember from the last chapter, the Romans are on the way out. The Roman Empire is facing its downfall. We're looking at more Germanic tribes coming into Gaul. So more opportunities for them to perhaps thrive and occupy a little further. So in this chapter, in chapter 3, we're talking about the Frankish dynasties, the Frankish rule. So what we're looking at in this chapter is mostly the Merovingians and the Carolingians. So in this module, we're going to be talking about the Merovingians. And this is a very complex part of history that involves many players and many names and many shifts of powers and changing of territories and frontiers. So I'm trying to simplify it for you as much as possible, and hopefully that will work out. So here we have the Merovingians and the Carolingians, the two main dynasties. So we're looking at a time period from about 500 to 1000 AD. And we're looking at about a 200-year rule for the Merovingians, 200, 250, and a 250-year rule for the Carolingians. Okay, so let's recap a little bit. Like I said, Roman Gaul is beginning to disintegrate. Why is that? That's because Rome is no longer expanding, so they don't have the revenue to maintain the peace that they have before, which was called the Pax Romana. And if you remember, if you recall from earlier, cities were thriving. The city was kind of the center of everything, and you could find everything in the market, and you had entertainment, and people lived in the cities. They even had apartments in the cities. Water was brought into the cities. So as Rome's funds are depleted, so are the cities. They can no longer sustain the infrastructure that they had before, and people start moving out into the country. People who are in the country actually move up the hills, so it's a movement away from the city, and this is due in part to the fact that there's decreased protection in the city, so it's easier to plunder, and it's also easier to just live off the land and be away from all of that and be self-sufficient versus depending on goods that are brought into market. So those two reasons, protection as well as self-sufficiency, force people to move out of the cities and into the country. So in the meantime, the Germanic tribes are actually successful at infiltrating Gaul. And as we talked about before, there were these borders, these frontiers called the limes, that were supposed to be kind of the customs of like the frontier as you would go through customs in an airport. Those were the frontiers of the Roman Empire, but they were very porous. So it wasn't exactly like a situation where Germanic tribes weren't coming in. They were actually trading goods with Roman Gaul. They had somewhat of a friendly relationship, so it wasn't a strict border. So the Germanic tribes actually were coming into Gaul, not only trading, but also as refugees, escaping their own life under barbarian rule. So the Romans had treaties with some Germanic tribes, and they would set up refugee camps, and they would train with them, and they even used them as frontiersmen, as people guarding the frontier. So they were using the people who they were guarding against to guard against their own people, which obviously might not be the best idea. Also, at this point, let's not forget that the different populations and the different tribes are mixing, they're meeting, so they're not exactly uniform. But as this is going on, of course, the confidence in Rome to maintain borders and to maintain its rule and to be able to provide the goods that it was providing before, the decreased military presence, all of this leads to a decrease in confidence in Rome. And a decrease in confidence in Rome obviously means opportunity for others. So what happens when there's opportunity? Somebody's going to seize it, and it leads to disputes, and somebody's going to come out on top. So this is where the Merovingian dynasty comes in. So this is one of the first important dynasties of what you could consider France in some fashion. And here I have put a chart of the Merovingian kings, starting with Clovis I. And there next to it is a list with the dates of their rules. So some of the dates of the rules change depending on which source you're consulting, but mostly you should just follow whatever your book says. Okay, so Clovis I was said to be descended from Merovich. Merovich was supposed to be, let's say, his grandfather. Merovich, it's not sure whether he's an actual person or if he was more of a fictional being that they made up to link the Merovingians to some kind of deity. So Merovich was thought to be a Frank warrior. Frankish warriors were very strong warriors, and they were used by the Romans at times to defeat other tribes that were threatening the Roman Empire, such as the Huns. He was thought to be half man, half god. As I said, Franks were used to defeat some tribes, such as the Huns. And supposedly he gave birth to a son called Childeric I. So Childeric I is supposed to be the son of Merovich. He's the father of Clovis, and his reign was, as you can see, about 25 years. And he also helped the Romans to push back invasions from other tribes. Now, other sources say that perhaps Childeric was the son of someone called Clodio. So it's unclear. Childeric was mentioned as being the son of Merovich in a historical work done by Gregory of Tours. But it was only mentioned once, and other sources seem to indicate that perhaps he's the son of Clodio. So perhaps the story of Merovich was made up to provide a link to a half-god, which, if you remember, Roman citizenship was based on the fact that they descended from Romulus and Remus. And Romulus and Remus were these two twins who founded Rome, and they were raised by a wolf and thought to be half-gods, basically. So in this case, we see a parallel between the Roman Empire and the Merovingians, where they consider deity to be a factor in who gets to be king. And this will be something that remains for a very long time. And actually, in present-day Europe, when you look at the kings, a lot of times they're somehow descendant from somebody who is linked to the choice of God. So you're not necessarily a god or a half-god, but you are God's choice. And we'll kind of look at that a little bit later, how that happens. Of course, it's political and kind of shady, but, that's history. Okay, so then we have Clovis. So Clovis is an important... Okay, I apologize for the interruption. Okay, so Clovis is the son of Childeric. And Clovis is actually a very important king in French history. So this is the first time where you basically see a major pushback against the Romans and other tribes. So he's trying to keep the borders intact somewhat. And another thing that he does, which is going to be extremely important in the centuries to come, is he becomes Christian. He makes Paris the capital, and he establishes Salic law. Salic comes from just a region north of France, and so there was a division between southern France and northern France as to which laws were used, but Clovis established Salic law. So at this point, you have to remember that this is history, and it's not a black or white thing. It's shades of gray. So changes are not made necessarily from one day to the next, but are rather done so incrementally or by region or by culture. So in this case, Salic law was something that was more of a northern thing. In the South, people tended to still continue to use Roman law or Gallo-Roman law. But they had a choice. So they still had a choice as to what they used. But let's look into Salic law because it's fairly interesting. Okay, so Salic law, one of the main things about Salic law is that it excluded women from ruling. So only men can rule. And so if you've ever wondered why royalty passes on from one man to another in certain countries, in Europe, this might be because of Salic law. I myself am from Belgium, and Belgium still holds on to that tenet of Salic law where rule cannot be passed down to a woman. So if you're the firstborn and you're a woman, you don't get the crown. Let's say you have a little brother, he's going to get the crown. Countries like England have done away with that. They don't use Salic law. But just to give you an idea of the influence that Salic law has had on Europe. So one of the things it did was exclude women from ruling. So I found this very interesting website, and let's take a look at it. And it's examples of Salic law. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of time to look at these. Okay, so one thing that you might notice is how, you have to understand that the Roman law code was fairly straightforward, but Salic law was not like the Roman law code. The Roman law code made a distinction between public and private. The Salic law code made private a much bigger part of the law. So you're looking at things like insults, and if you look at Title 41 concerning the murder of free men, if anyone shall have killed a free Frank or a barbarian living under the Salic law, and it have been proved on him, he shall be sentenced to 8,000 dinars. Okay, but if he shall have thrown him into a well or into the water, or shall have covered him with branches or anything else to conceal him, he shall be sentenced 24,000 dinars, which makes 600 shillings. Okay, so much graver crime if you conceal the crime. If you don't conceal the crime, you might get away with it somehow. But if you conceal the crime, this triples the amount of money that you owe. Okay, if anyone has slain a man who is in the service of the king, he shall be sentenced to 24,000 dinars, which makes 600 shillings, regardless of whether you put him under branches, or actually, this is if you admit to it. But if he have put in water or a well, covered him with anything to conceal him, he shall be sentenced to 72,000 dinars, which makes 1,800 shillings. So here you see concealing a crime is definitely a much greater offense than actually committing a crime. So then you might ask yourself, well, what does it mean to owe 72,000 dinars or 1,800 shillings? And that would be an excellent question, because the concept of money, although not exactly a new concept, is a fluid concept. It's not set in stone. So let's say a man could sell a pig for 600 dinars, and another man can sell a pig for 900 dinars. You know, they're going to collect different amounts of money for the same product. But they don't really know how much their pig is worth. This would definitely vary between regions and villages and people. So the concept of money is not a concrete concept. It's a very abstract concept. And at that point in time, things like land and precious metals are much more valuable than the concept of shillings and dinars. Of course, you can run into trouble because you have to pay taxes, and if you owe a certain amount, you know, your neighbor who sold his pig for more than you have might be able to pay the taxes better than you can, and you're stuck and now you're poor. So the concept of money was not something that everybody could fully understand or really get behind. So land and precious metals and precious stones were considered much more concrete than money. But also you should note, if you should go see that website, because it's got some weird stuff in it. All right, so here's the territory under Clovis the First. As you can see, it's very large, and it sort of looks like France, with some stuff added on and some stuff taken off. So you can see that there's Switzerland, there's parts of Belgium, there's Holland, there's Germany in there. So it's a large territory. So at this point, it's larger than the state of Texas, which might not sound impressive to you, but considering that it's the 8th century or the 9th century, this would be very impressive. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Merovingians and religion. So as I mentioned, one of the things that they took from the Romans, or I should say it's a continuity of the Roman concept, was that the rulers somehow had greater power. They were associated with deities. So in this case, the Merovingians placed themselves so that they were seen as rulers chosen by God. So they're not actual deities, but they are man's best. So here we see a continuation of Christianity, which the Romans had established. Now, in the last chapter, when the Roman Empire started deteriorating, there was a return to Celtic traditions and pagan traditions, but Clovis, being baptized, firmly established Christianity, which you'll see later on will be even more firmly established by another ruler. But as you can see, Christianity is the religion to have if you want to be in the good favor of the king. So this gets interesting because something that Clovis did is he sort of kept the structure of that the Romans had established with the regional administrations, but instead of having it administered by politician, now the administrator was a bishop or somebody religious. So now what you see is you have dioceses, and the bishops rule over these dioceses. And why was power given to religious figures? It was because they were the detainers of knowledge. So if you picture yourself in that time, if you're a regular person, you don't know how to read, you don't know how to write, you don't know how to do much really. But the religious figures in your area, these are the people who they know how to write, they know how to read, they have access to perhaps somewhat historical documents. They probably have some kind of Bible that they can read from. They also are adept at being artists. So as you saw in the movie, the people who did the illuminations were monks typically, or they worked in monasteries or abbeys. These were religious people. That's all they did all day was write and draw and collect ink and make ink and process paper. All these things took a lot of time. It's not like nowadays where you just have a Word document and you print it on your computer and your printer. But back then you had to make the paper. You had to find the materials to make the paper. You had to find the materials to make the ink. You had to have the right kind of feather. You had to have the right kind of writing implements. You had to have nice colors, and a lot of skill went into that. And at the same time, they studied the texts, and they were much more knowledgeable about these texts than anybody else was. So they were seen as the erudites, as the detainers of knowledge. And so they kind of also became sources of authority. And Clovis, being a Christian, gave them the authority that they needed to govern regions. So hence they become the administrator of diocese or region or a village or what have you. So on the other hand, since Clovis was a Christian, he also rewarded religious leaders with gifts. So at this time, the empire is expanding. So the Romans are gone, the Franks are in, and the Franks are expanding. And so that means that they're bringing revenue in the form of lands, revenue in the form of textiles, revenue in the form of precious metals and precious stones. And what they do with that is that they can reward people with these precious metals, with these precious stones, with these lands. They can give them more power that way, and they can bestow upon them gifts. Okay, so as I said, they're bestowing gifts. So why do they do that? they do that because they perceive some people as valuable and some people as being able to either rule or expand the land. And this could be equated to modern day. Here in LA, a lot of that goes on. Let's say you want a favor from someone down the road. If you have some front row tickets to the Laker game, you might go ahead and give them your front row tickets, and perhaps in a month or so expect a favor, or reward them because they've obtained $1 million contract for something with Laker tickets or with a car or what have you. So same type of thing, where it was really a reward system. But for that system to work, you really have to take from others. Just as we saw with the Romans, they had somewhat of a similar system in acquiring land, but when you stop acquiring land and you're unable to tax new people, you run out of money. So, but in this case, we're still expanding, we're still plundering, everybody's happy. So at this point, the Franks are perceived as better than the Romans because the Romans offer no protection. The Romans gave them cities and gave them all this infrastructure, and then the infrastructure started crumbling. They had to move away from the cities. The cities were being plundered. So then the Romans start being perceived as, well, what good are you? You come here, you invade the land, you take everything, but then we have a nice, comfortable life, status quo, things are going well, middle class, not too bad. But then everything kind of crumbles, and they have to move away from the cities, and they have to go back to the way of life that they knew way before, that their ancestors knew. They have to go back to more rural areas. So at this point, the Franks are seen as kind of a better alternative than the Romans, because the Romans are no longer able to fulfill their promises of peace. And also the Franks replaced the Romans as the protectors. So let's not forget that, this territory, this is a fruitful territory. This is a nice place to live. It has the sea, it has rivers, it has mountains, it's, cattle, a lot of things are there. France is a wonderful place, very cultivable. So other tribes are trying to come in. It's not like the Franks came in and, everybody else was like, oh, okay, it's the Franks now. No. So other tribes are still trying to come in and invade what used to be Gaul. So, or not just, so you have the Iberians, the Africans, the Iranians, everybody is trying to come in still. So the Franks are offering protection against invasion from other tribes. Okay, so this basically sums up what I said. It's a reward system. The reward is land and valuable goods. Valuable goods being precious metals like gold and silver, and also precious stones, which we can see in some of the artifacts found during that time period. So the reason for this were favors that they could get from people, which would help them expand the territory, plunder further, collect more, bring more in, be able to give out more favors. Like I said, the Franks are perceived as better. The Romans have failed. The Romans are gone. They didn't maintain that lifestyle. They weren't able to. Obviously, it wasn't as solid of a system as they had hoped it would be. And like I said, the Franks are offering protection against the other tribes that are absolutely willing to invade what now is the Merovingian Empire. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the economy. So, like I said, the urban economy completely weakened. Um, the Roman cities are just decimated. Um, since the Roman infrastructure isn't there and isn't being maintained, people flee the city and go to the country and become self-sufficient again. Um, so trade with Eastern areas, and by Eastern we mean the rest of the Roman Empire, are weakened. As you can imagine, the infrastructure is weakened. The roads aren't as good. There are barbarians ready to steal what you have. So if you, let's say you wanna export a big shipment of olive oil, they would be ready to take it. Or whatever else you have, and you're probably carrying some cash on you or some precious metals or some stones. So the trade definitely weakened. Networks were disrupted. Networks being mostly the highways that were built by the Romans. So what does that do? That fragments the territory, and you have to rely a lot more on local economies. You have to rely on your town. You have to rely on the town next to you. The areas that you can travel to where you can do it yourself and not rely on some larger company type thing. Okay, so it becomes less of a money economy. Like I said, we're not dealing with the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was very systematic about things. The laws were systematic. The prices were systematic. The Romans were precise. We are no longer dealing with a precise society. We're dealing with a society where money is fluid. You have money, but you're doing a lot of bartering. And what you want is not really money. What you want is land. What you want is gold. What you want is silver. You don't necessarily want money, because that might not always translate as well. So a lot of the dealings are more done on a bartering system, and that the money status is a little fluid. So as I said before, plunder is a crucial part of this economy. It's an economy, as with the Romans, where if you don't expand, you're failing. So there is a constant need for expansion and a constant need for people who are able to conquer new lands and go forth to bring back more treasure, more land, more valuable goods. Also, I did want to talk about the fact that because the Roman infrastructure weakened, and there was less money in the structure, in the system, and the infrastructure crumbled, and everything became slightly unclear, like how much things were worth. Who suffers? Who suffers when that happens? Well, the poor suffer, because the poor don't necessarily know how much things are worth, or they don't know how to bargain properly, or what can they do? Can they really bargain? Not really. They don't have a choice. If they have to sell their beets, they have to sell their beets. Those are perishable goods. So the poor suffered after the decline of Rome, and we can see this because there were a number of famines and a plague that happened in the 6th century. So it wasn't necessarily a good thing. So you see that less infrastructure can lead to taking advantage of people, and also people not really knowing where they belong, and then struggling and becoming sick. So there you have it. Okay, so we can talk about law for a little bit. Like I said before, the Gallo-Romans could choose to be judged either by Roman law or Salic law. And if you recall, I said that Roman law had a clear distinction between things that were public and private. Salic law depended much more on things that were private, depending on family and kinship. So, as an example, Salic law would see women as property, whereas Roman law would see them as property owners. So one thing you could see with Salic law is, another type of discrimination against women is that you saw that polygyny was okay. So that means that men were, for a while, able to marry several women. That was okay. However, if a woman wanted to divorce a man, if she started those proceedings, she would be smothered in mire. So that gives you an idea of where women stood at those times under Frankish rule. So in a lot of ways, women were better off under Roman rule than under Frankish rule. So what did women do? Women have to be resourceful. Women went to the church, and what happened during this time period is that women developed a more important role in the church, and if they needed to, they would go into the convent. A number of convents were established where women could go and feel safe. Of course, that means that they have to become a nun, without a doubt. But it was a place where maybe perhaps a woman who couldn't marry, or who somehow was able not to marry, or let's say an older woman who needed some form of protection, these women could go into convents and feel safe, relatively safe. So it did give them a path other than marriage. Now, another thing that happened is that if you were part of a more powerful family and you were a woman, then you had more power. But that was very anecdotal and depends on the woman herself. But the church did begin to encourage the sanctity of marriage. So they did not want to see a man have several wives, which protected the woman. As you can imagine, if a man has several wives, then they're probably not all equally important. I mean, you don't cherish what you have a lot of. So the church stepping in and saying, no, you can only have one wife and you have to cherish her, was an important step for women. However, they were still kind of just property, really. But it did give them a little bit of security, as did the convents, who offered them a fair amount of protection. Okay, so the effect of the fusion of public and private spheres. So as I said, the Roman law, public and private were kept completely separate, but the Salic law did not keep them separate. So going from Romans to Franks, we can see a massive lack of structure, and both physically and also in government. So we're dealing with decrepit infrastructure around the territory. They're not maintaining the aqueducts. They're not maintaining the roads. They're not maintaining the Roman cities. They're not maintaining the Roman way of life. but also as well they're not maintaining the Roman political structure and the administrative structure. So they don't have um, a hierarchy of people in administration making sure that things are running properly and reporting to higher ups and dealing with problems. So we have a large weakening of central power. This is no longer a centralized state with a clear leader at its head. This is a decentralized state with many factions under one ruler, but no uniformity in system. So you do have ruling families, which are the local ruling families, and they become the center of authority. Of course, the main ruler does not have a system to enforce his authority. So the people who are going to rule you, who are going to rule the people, are going to be local. They have to maintain law enforcement in their own way. The other thing that we see, which fits into the whole pattern of weakened central power and lack of structure and fragmentation of an empire, is that the borders become much more fluid. You no longer have a vast army to send out whenever you choose to go protect a certain area that needs protecting. You now have regions that are protecting their borders with much fewer resources. So there is a lack of control at the periphery. So around the borders, things are not clear, things are not sure. People can come in, people can invade, people can plunder. So there's definitely that opportunity for others to come in and take what they want and settle if they want. They can settle in your area and they can take whatever you want, and they can, rape the women and set fire to everybody's hut. It's up to them. So due to the lack of central government, there's no longer this large infrastructure where you can send out a massive number of soldiers to protect a certain area. Now you kind of have to protect yourself. Okay, so a little bit about Merovingian dynasty. Lasted well into the 8th century. Like I said, it's kind of divided in two, where it's first 250 is Merovingian, and then the next 250 is Carolingian. They were nicknamed the long-haired kings and the do-nothing kings. So like we talked about, lack of central power. But, it's difficult to maintain that central power. Rome had many centuries to develop its system, and it developed it well, and it had people who were subservient and people who fulfilled their role. Everybody had a job. It was a very structured society. Now you find yourself in a much more unstructured society. There's one declared leader, but at the same time, how are you to communicate with that leader effectively? If there's a problem in your area and you're being invaded by, people from the south or people from the north, how are you to tell your king that? And how is your king going to act on that? So they were nicknamed the do-nothing kings because really they just didn't have a system to do anything. Perhaps they could have developed it, but, you learn from your mistakes. They're also nicknamed the long-haired kings because they all kind of had long hair, and perhaps that was reminiscent of Jesus, or, closeness to God, having long hair. So, as I said, there was no system, and that was kind of a major downfall for the Merovingians. Okay, other things to consider. Now we're calling the territories ruled by the Franks Francia. Um, the expansion continues, even though, let's just say it's a fragmented expansion. It's a tenuous expansion. It's not like the Romans who had a solid grip on things. This is much more of well, they're expanding, but can they hold on to it? That's a different thing. Now we're seeing also that territories and titles are inherited. Like I said, a lot of the Merovingian Empire or rule depended on rewards. So rewards are land, rewards are titles, rewards are valuable goods, but mostly really land. And more land gives you title. Okay, so it wasn't a unified territory, with the exception of Dagobert, who did not rule for all that long. It's you have to remember that at the time, I mean, it's just really a lot of people fighting a lot of other people for dominion of this empire of a region. So he was able to maintain rulership for 6 years. Dagobert, to most Francophone people or to most French people, myself included, is known for this song, which I found out was written in the 18th century, which is right before the Revolution, which is a period of time where many parodies were written about royalty. But anyways, this song about Dagobert is, the first verse starts with Dagobert putting his pants backward and somebody telling him that his pants are backwards, and he says, "Oh yeah, I guess they are backwards." And the whole song kind of makes him look like a buffoon. One verse is, he has an iron sword, and the same person points out to him, who's a religious person, by the way. That person points out to him, "Oh, you could hurt yourself with that sword." So he says, "Oh yeah, just give me a wooden sword." A wooden sword is something that children use, not kings. But the king here agrees after the religious person tells him that, and that just kind of gives you perhaps like a view of what people might perceive the royalty to become at some point, because there is somewhat of a mutually beneficial relationship between royalty and religion, which we'll see later on too. And other than that, people still spoke a form of Gallo-Roman language, which is a precursor to French. So now we're going to end the Merovingians, and the Merovingians give place to the Carolingians, and the Carolingians are quite a dynasty. So we'll look into that. And no questions on this one. The questions will be at the end of the Carolingians.